Hi, environmental science students. We'll dive into chapter 12 today, focusing on agriculture and the ecology of food. So modern agriculture is facing many problems. First of all, the world's population has undergone exponential growth over the last 200 years, and our population is expected to reach 9.5 billion by the year 2050. While the human population continues to grow, the area that's available for cultivation of crops and production of animals is basically maxed out. In order to increase agricultural production, we have started growing single species over large areas, like corn, and this is called monocultures. And there are many problems with establishing monocultures because when a pest or another type of disease gets into that large stand of, in this example, corn, the whole crop can be wiped out. Agriculture now consumes 70% of the world's water in irrigation. It applies 184 million tons of fertilizer and spends $34 billion on herbicides and pesticides every year. Excess inputs of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides wash away as runoff, and there are many unintended environmental consequences of polluting streams and rivers, killing beneficial insects, and even impacting human health. Plus, in previous chapters, we've talked about the consequences of adding too much fertilizer and that fertilizer getting into the streams and creating dead zones as a result of eutrophication. Now, the question in agriculture today is, how can we feed hundreds of millions of extra mouths in the world each year, yet sustain the farmland on which we will depend in the future? In the next two slides, I'll talk about two different approaches for farming in the future. One example is at a place called White Oak Pastures, and they specialize in diversity and renewal. At this particular farm, they have 10 species of animals and a wide variety of heritage vegetables, fruits, and nuts, 40 different varieties. They use the byproducts of these goods to produce other products like soap, candles, honey, pet shoes, and a variety of other options. At this particular farm, they've basically eliminated any external inputs, and this farm basically produces no waste. So the aspect they focus on is their variety and biodiversity. At White Oak Pastures, they have this multi-species grazing rotation. And so they have domesticated animals and that follow the natural model of the Serengeti. Cattle eat the grass, goats and sheep eat weeds, and chickens follow behind, eating invertebrates and parasites. All of these species contribute to fertilizing the soil. In contrast to White Oak Pastures, we have McCormick Farms, which is a high-tech agricultural facility. In 2016, McCormick was voted Georgia Farmer of the Year. Now, his approach is to plant genetically modified crops. We'll talk more about GMOs later on in this chapter. And he focuses on growing corn, soybeans, and cotton, as well as peanuts. This farmer believes in the power of technology and implementing innovative farming techniques to increase efficiency and crop yield. His techniques reuse fuel, and he also focuses on applying specific amounts of fertilizers and irrigation water. So he reduces runoff and waste while at the same time increasing crop yields. Here are a few examples of the smart technology that McCormick uses on his fields. He has real-time information about the location of his tractors that sync with maps and that create from sensors in the ground. And then he's able to use that information from sensors to adjust the chemical application to meet the crop's needs. He also uses variable rate irrigation, which allows the amount of irrigation to be adjusted, again, based on the crop needs, which would partly be determined by how deep the crop's roots grow. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for about 250,000 years. During the vast majority of that time, humans lived as hunters and gatherers. It's only been in about the past 10,000 years that humans started to practice agriculture. Agriculture is the system of land management used to grow domesticated plants and animals for food, fiber, or energy. Agriculture originated independently in several regions as a consequence of changing climates, diminishing wild resources, and human cultural and technological progress. Since the Middle Ages, agricultural production has increased as a consequence of refined technologies, continued plant and animal breeding, and changes in land management. Increased mechanization during the Industrial Revolution accelerated this trend in production. During the past century, agricultural production has increased several-fold due to the use of fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. Anthropologists have been trying to figure out why agriculture arose at the same time in various regions around the world. There is little doubt that climate change associated with the close of the last ice age were an important factor in the establishment of agriculture. Climates started to get warmer, and dry seasons were growing considerably longer. Scientists argue that these conditions favored the evolution of plants with adaptations that made them ideal targets for domestication. Most anthropologists now agree that human communities turned to agriculture because their growing populations were placing greater demands on ecosystem resources and producing shortages of wild food. Agriculture was a better alternative because it allowed people to produce more food for their larger communities. These theories about when and why humans adopted agriculture are, of course, not mutually exclusive. Climate change was a necessary precondition for agricultural development, while population growth and increasingly scarce wild resources provided incentives for this important cultural shift. This table points to traits that are useful for the domestication of plants and animals. Let's start with animals first. Those animals that have a flexible diet, a rapid growth rate, that can be bred in captivity, animals with a calm disposition, tendency to aggregate, and a short time to maturity are all characteristics that favor domestication. Now, in regards to plants, annual grasses, those plants with lots of seed production, those plants that can survive during dry periods, plants with bulbs and tubers, those that are easy to grow, those that are easy to store, and those with limited seed dispersal are all attributes that point towards easy domestication. The earliest agriculture depended on stone tools. Later developments included ceramic, bronze, and iron tools like hoes, rakes, and sickles. Tending crops with these tools would have required a great deal of labor. The invention of the plow coincided with the domestication of cattle. Cattle provided the power needed to pull plows, reducing the amount of human energy invested in producing crops. The period from AD 1400 to 1700 brought even greater changes. The discovery of the Americas resulted in an influx of new crops to Europe and Asia, such as corn, potatoes, tobacco, and tomatoes. There was a type of plow called the moldboard plow that was imported from China. These plows turn soil more efficiently than conventional plows and greatly reduce the amount of labor to grow crops. Farmers also began to use a system of crop rotation, alternating between grain and legume crops. Throughout the industrial, and I want to mention that that type of rotation is really important in maintaining the fertility of soil, because what one of those crops takes out, the other puts back in. So the grains take out a lot of nitrogen, but the legume crops actually put nitrogen back into the soil. Throughout the industrial period, the rapidly increasing understanding of the science of plants, animals, and soils resulted in numerous agricultural innovations. Agronomy is the science that applies knowledge from fields such as genetics, physiology, chemistry, ecology, all of those goodies into agriculture. For example, the growing understanding of genetics led to increasingly sophisticated plant and animal breeding. Over the past 50 to 60 years, we've witnessed the Green Revolution, a period during which global agricultural productivity has increased many times over. Much of this increase in production is the result of the development of modern fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. Synthetic nitrogen fixation uses the Haber-Bosch process and significantly increased the ability of nitrogen fertilizers and also decreased their costs. Okay, so here's the deal. Nitrogen is taken out of our soils by certain types of crops like corn and grains. And as I mentioned in a previous slide, nitrogen is naturally put back into the soil by legumes. And this Haber-Bosch process created a fertilizer that synthetically introduced nitrogen into our soils. And so because of that, we were able to increase production. Now, there's certainly problems with the Haber-Bosch process, especially involving one of the scientists involved. He was associated with the Nazis. So there are certainly issues there that I encourage you to investigate. So what this means is that prior to Haber-Bosch, that process, the production of most crops was limited by nitrogen availability. So after that process was established, the widespread use of fertilizers has been central to the Green Revolution and are dramatically increased crop production. Herbicides and pesticides have allowed farmers to control weeds, insects, and various diseases that compete with humans for the productivity of farm fields. When I was in graduate school taking classes on soil biology, I learned a lot about nitrogen and the nitrogen fixation process. And it's absolutely fascinating because here's the deal. We have so much nitrogen in our atmosphere. 78% of the molecules in Earth's atmosphere are nitrogen, but less than 1% of nitrogen is found in the Earth's crust. So in order to get nitrogen into the biosphere, atmospheric nitrogen goes through a process called nitrogen fixation. Now, nitrogen fixation is a process that converts nitrogen gas to ammonia. A small amount of nitrogen fixation occurs by lightning, but most nitrogen fixation is carried out in the soil by nitrogen fixing bacteria. Once nitrogen is fixed, then it can be incorporated into plants and those organisms that eat plants. So plants need nitrogen because they need it to produce nitrogen-containing amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. And we, animals, need nitrogen as well to produce proteins. Another thing I want to talk about here is the process of decomposition. So when decomposers break down the remains of plants and animals, that ammonia is recycled back into the soil. So the nitrogen is cycled back into the soil through decomposers. There are some nitrogen-fixing microbes that hang out in the soil and live independently in soil and soil water. But one of the coolest aspects of these microbes are those that coexist in symbiotic relationships with plants, including legumes, which I talked about earlier. Remember, we talked about crop rotation and that some crops actually put soil or put nitrogen back into the soil. So a legume, an example of a legume are plants that belong to the pea family. These are organisms that host these microbes that fix nitrogen. So farmers take advantage of this relationship by introducing legumes like peanuts, alfalfa, and peas into the crop rotation and using the microbes to add nitrogen naturally back into the soil. So then nitrogen in soil and water is returned to the atmosphere by a process called denitrification. And so the process then begins again. Just like forest ecosystems or stream ecosystems or tropical ecosystems, agroecosystems depend on the cycling of nutrients. And so these agricultural systems are actually prone to nutrient loss because we take things away from that system, right? Through harvest. So we remove biomass from the system, and that biomass in a natural state would decompose and return those nutrients to the soil. Additionally, in agricultural systems, soil is continually disturbed. Now, there are more and more practices that are coming about that are sustainable, like no-till agriculture. But when you rotate the soil to plant crops, those soils become incredibly vulnerable to erosion. You're removing any vegetation that might be there and allowing wind and water to transport those nutrient-rich soils away. Also, through irrigation, if too much irrigated water is applied to agricultural lands, all of that water can leach nutrients out of the soil profile or into deeper layers of the soil that are not accessible to plants. I should also mention that different irrigation techniques like flood irrigation often ends up leading to the accumulation of salts in an area or salinization of the soil. And the other thing about agrosystems is that generally there's a low biodiversity. Large farms tend to have monocultures with one large crop. So low biodiversity, so there are very few species there to help add to the nutrients that are being returned to the soil. The growth of crops doesn't just depend on the nutrients that are available, but also on the health of other organisms living in that same ecosystem. This includes pollinating insects, bacteria, fungus, and other things that live in the soil. Now, before seeds and fruits can form, the flowers of crop plants must be pollinated. Insects pollinate vegetable, fruit, and nut crops, which make up about a third of the human diet. Honeybees are among the most important insect pollinators, but the loss of their natural habitat has resulted in very sparse populations of wild honeybees. Instead, domesticated honeybees raised by beekeepers provide this essential ecosystem service. Remember that term, ecosystem service, from several chapters ago? So honeybees provide a crucial ecosystem service for many crops. A diverse community of soil organisms helps recycle nutrients in these ecosystems. Earthworms are some of the most visible of soil organisms. They feed on dead leaves and other organic matter in the soil, and they move through the soil, they help oxygenate the soil, and they leave residue behind and for soil nutrients that can eventually be used by crops. Of course, there are pests and pathogens in soil as well. When we have a natural ecosystem that is thriving, those pests and pathogens can be kept under control, but we often have to rely on pesticides and herbicides to keep things in control. But there are natural ways that we will talk about, as well as an integrated pest management system that provides different pathways to help prevent pest and pathogens from taking over. In most natural ecosystems like prairies and forests, those areas build topsoil through the constant accumulation of organic matter and protection of the soil that's already in place because of all of the vegetation. Organic matter is constantly being added to the soils, replenishing the stock of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And when we don't have that natural vegetative cover, we start seeing problems with water erosion and wind erosion that removes the nutrient-rich topsoil or A horizon from agricultural fields that are exposed on a seasonal basis or every other year. So water erosion is problematic in agricultural fields as well as wind erosion. So when raindrops fall on exposed soil, they dislodge soil particles, and then that soil is carried along by the surface flow. And then running water can cut a small gully and moves water through that channel. It cuts in deeper and deeper and incisors greatly into those agricultural areas. Wind erosion is also a major problem with removing those nutrient-rich A horizons. And so I have several best practices to help prevent soil erosion listed here. By keeping soil covered, having a cover crop, disturbing the soil as little as possible, using no-till agriculture. That means using methods that just directly put a seed into the soil without tilling it. Keep plants growing all year on the soil to help feed the soil. Crop rotations between those nitrogen fixing crops and those crops that remove nitrogen from the soil. Planting shelter belts and windbreaks or trees along the edges of fields and in between fields. Terracing helps prevent water erosion, and the use of contour farming. In the next slide, you'll see some pictures or photographs of some of these different techniques. As we see energy costs and competing demands for limited supplies of water increase, the need to conserve water resources in agroecosystems has become very, very clear. To increase water use efficiency, decrease runoff, and minimize salinization, remember that's when soils get salty, many farmers are turning to drip irrigation. In drip irrigation systems, underground or even above ground pipes, as shown in this photograph, there are small openings in these pipes at the base of each plant to feed water to the root zone. And this decreases the amount of evaporation that occurs. So it decreases water wasted by evaporation, and it also reduces the rate of salinization, because less evaporation means that less salt is left behind in the soil. And salt is not good for our crops. The production of large numbers of domesticated animals like chickens, pigs, and cows presents a number of challenges to the environment and human health. These include issues related to waste production, changed patterns of land use, and transmission of diseases. Methane gas, a greenhouse gas, is a byproduct of the digestion of nearly all herbivores. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas that is 23 times as effective as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we talked about earlier this semester, estimates that methane emissions from domestic livestock account for more than 5% of current global warming. Methane, which can be burned like natural gas, is a potential energy source. So realizing this, many managers of domestic animal facilities are beginning to install waste treatment systems that capture that methane and use it to generate electricity. Livestock operations and large feedlots often cause major changes in land use. In many developing nations, forests are being cleared to create pasture for sheep, goats, and cattle. Deforestation contributes to climate change, reduces watershed protection, and threatens biodiversity. As humans and our domesticated animals have co-evolved, so have the diseases that infect them. Livestock like sheep, cattle, and pigs are hosts for parasites that can also impact humans. Bacteria like E. coli causes deadly infections in people, and this E. coli can grow in intestines of cattle, goats, and pigs with no problems. They don't suffer from it. Viruses that are responsible for various forms of flu can originate from populations of swine or domestic birds. The next time you're purchasing food at a grocery store, consider your purchases and how the food that you're choosing impacts the environment. So, for example, 1 kilogram of milk requires 1.1 kilograms of feed to produce that milk. 2.8 grams of feed is required to produce 1 kilogram of chicken. And so you can take a look at this and you can see the gigantic difference between the amount of feed required to produce 1 kilogram of chicken compared to 1 kilogram of beef. Now, don't get me wrong. I love a good steak and I eat steak, but we need to consider what our food choices mean for the environment. One of the things that my family does, and I've mentioned this to a few students, is that we rely heavily on meat that we harvest by hunting. And that meat is actually healthier, involving the nutrients and the fats in venison or elk, for example. Plus, harvesting by hunting is actually beneficial to the environment as well, because these giant feedlots have such a huge footprint in regards to land use as well as waste. So cows require the greatest feed per kilogram of edible weight. So keep that in mind. Like with these, beef requires the most energy, pork a little bit less, and then chicken and milk have the lower impacts. Although dairy farms, there are issues with dairy farms as well. But when you're making choices involving food, try your best to shop local, although in Nevada that's kind of hard. If you can grow your own food in the summer and then do canning, that all helps keep our resources local, and we don't have to use as much fossil fuels to get the meat or food from California or even farther away. we can do our best to keep it local. With industrial development, humans have become dependent on fewer and fewer species of crops and domestic animals. While selective breeding, hybridization, and cloning have produced highly productive strands of domestic plants and animals, they have also greatly reduced the genetic diversity within some species. The genetic homogeneity increases the risk that disease or environmental change could jeopardize human food supplies. Older varieties of crops and livestock have greater genetic diversity. That diversity may be important for future adaptation. Genetic engineering holds promise for improving the rate of production, nutritional value, and disease resistance of some crops. However, care must be taken to avoid negative environmental impacts that could arise from these genetic techniques. We need to talk about turkeys. Okay, the turkeys on the left are domestic turkeys, and these turkeys have been selected for their high production of breast meat and rapid growth in crowded conditions. These poor turkeys have to be artificially inseminated. They have to be hatched in incubators and raised in protected houses. They are so large, they can't even have sex to produce offspring. Okay, so there are some major issues there, in my opinion, with turkey production. The turkey on the right is an heirloom variety that can still fly, and it can still find its own food. It can mate on its own, and it can also rear its own offspring. So if you have the space to raise your own turkey, I highly encourage you to do so. My neighbors have a large turkey roaming around in their backyard right now. One of my dreams is to have chickens and a few turkeys and maybe even some ducks that we could harvest for meat as well as eggs, but my family isn't quite there with me on that idea yet. Hopefully sometime soon. Since the dawn of agriculture, we have been using artificial selection and crossbreeding to create new genetic combinations in plants and animals. Over time, this has created the great majority of domesticated plants and animals that we see today. However, this form of breeding is limited to selecting among the traits that already exist within a species or within closely related species that can be crossbred. But now, with the development of modern genetic technology, it has become possible for geneticists to develop new varieties by taking a gene from the cells of one species and inserting it into the cells of another. The new varieties have a mixture of traits not achievable with more traditional methods of genetic improvement. These are called genetically modified organisms. So an organism whose DNA has been altered by these new techniques is a genetically modified organism. Now, genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, can improve yields, improve disease and pest resistance, like BT corn. These techniques can add nutrients like golden rice. Grains of golden rice have beta-carotene, which gives them that yellow color. Now, GMOs are controversial, and a lot of people do not want to consume GMOs. There are labels that allow consumers to know if the food that they are eating contains GMOs or is a non-GMO food. Weeds, pests, and plant diseases have plagued farmers since the beginning of agriculture. Scientific studies of 8 of the world's most commonly cultivated crops indicate that 42% of all agricultural productivity is consumed by pests and disease. This is true in spite of all the pesticides and pest control practices used to protect our crops. Early pesticides killed a wide variety of organisms and often led to the evolution of pesticide-resistant insect pests. Additionally, some of those previous chemical pest control methods like DDT had a major impact on our environment. So DDT would be sprayed over an area, it would get into our water resources, become incorporated in that aquatic setting, and the DDT would accumulate in the bodies of plants and then the organisms that ate the plants. So a lot of fish would have high levels of that particular chemical pest control in their body. Okay, moving on. Now, today agriculturalists try to use pesticides that break down quickly and affect a narrow range of species. They also time the application of pesticides carefully in order to have the greatest effect. To avoid the undesirable effects of pesticides, many farmers now use biological controls. These are awesome. These are organisms like beetles that parasitize or prey on pests. So you could release some beneficial insects like a certain type of beetle into an area that's infested with whitetop, a common weed that grows in Nevada. Those beetles would devour the whitetop and move on to other whitetop populations and get rid of that whitetop without using any chemicals. Good agricultural practices can make the crop environment less suitable for pest species, reducing the need for chemical pest control. Such practices include careful crop inspection and quarantines. Yes, crops are too required to quarantine every once in a while. Crop rotation and integrated pest management are also really good practices to maintain a healthy agricultural space. A little bit more about quarantines. These quarantines prevent the introduction of exotic pests in the first place. The laws of agricultural states such as Florida, Arizona, and California require fruits and live plants to be carefully inspected before they are brought across their borders. Crop rotation is the practice of replacing one crop species with another on an annual planting cycle. This helps to control pest populations because pests tend to specialize in a particular crop plant. Weeds can be controlled by mechanically disturbing the soil between crop rows or by mulching. Because remember, disturbing soil isn't a good idea because that decreases soil fertility. Mulching is important because it involves covering the ground with plant material or plastic sheeting to prevent weeds from germinating near crop plants. And then chemical, biological, and cultural means of pest control are not mutually exclusive strategies. We can use them together. So integrated pest management, IPM, is the effective combination of all three kinds of pest control. Okay, chemical, biological, and cultural. And PM is carefully designed to manage pest populations while also minimizing environmental damage. It is not the goal of IPM to completely eradicate pests. Rather, IPM aims to keep pest populations small enough to minimize crop loss while also controlling the cost of their management. As omnivores, we can choose where to eat on the food chain. From well-established principles of ecosystem ecology, we know that our ecological footprint increases as we shift from an omnivore to a carnivorous lifestyle. So meat consumption greatly increases your ecological footprint. Our ecological footprint is also influenced by the place where our food is grown and the amount of energy and materials used to transport, process, and market our food. The choices that individual consumers make about what to eat and how it is produced affect the environment and directly influence human well-being. I'll have a slide about food miles coming up, and remember that earlier slide where I showed comparisons between how much feed is required to produce 1 kilogram of beef compared to chicken, eggs, milk, and pork. As Americans, we have started to consume more and more organic products over the years. Initially, when organic produce and meat became available, it was incredibly expensive. Today, organic produce and meats are still more expensive than those methods of traditional agriculture produced fruits, vegetables, and meats. However, they aren't nearly as expensive as they once were. Now that large grocery chains like Walmart and Target, Aldi, and others have their own brands of organic foods, those prices have decreased. Now, don't get me wrong, there are major problems with those large big box retailers, but it is making organic produce more available to the regular folks, and hopefully people can consume more and more organic foods. So organic foods are produced with chemically or pesticide-free methods. So they would include biological methods of pest control, and these foods are also non-GMO foods. This figure complements the figure that I showed you guys earlier about the amount of feed required to produce a kilogram of beef, pork, chicken, eggs, and milk. Now, this graph shows a variety of food sources and beverage choices on the x-axis, and then the amount of water in gallons on the y-axis to produce 1 pound of any of these food choices. So 0.12 gallons of water are used to produce 1 pound of vegetables, 468 gallons of water are used to produce 1 pound of chicken, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that there's close to 2,000 gallons of water required to produce 1 pound of beef. And then check this out. I'm so sorry to give you guys this news. Get this, 3,170 gallons of water are required to produce 1 pound of chocolate. That makes me super sad. Anyhow, keep this in mind. as you make your food choices. The challenges of sustainable agriculture can be met by improved education and more environmentally conscious public policies. But the most powerful force for change lies in the choices made by us, the consumers. The agricultural economy follows preferences of grocery shoppers and restaurant patrons, so each person exercises choices in the way food is grown, processed, and delivered. People in wealthy countries have the luxury of a great variety of food choices, which in turn influences agricultural practices. With these choices comes a greater responsibility to support a sustainable future. In this slide, I have some simple approaches for you to consider when making choices about food. So take a look at these. Eat local, eat more plants, reduce food waste, eat fresh foods, eat seasonal foods, choose sustainable products, and ask your local grocer questions. Encourage them to get more and more foods from local sources. This slide gives a good example of the amount of resources required to get food to a local grocery store. So this example is for a store in Georgia, okay, and the store is getting carrots, tomatoes, lettuce, and strawberries from different parts of our country and the world. Okay, so in order for the tomatoes to get to Georgia, it requires 1,583 miles for the tomatoes to get there. Carrots, even more. Lettuce, even more miles. And then the strawberries come from Chile. All right, so consider all of the fossil fuels required to get those vegetables to that store in Georgia. But if we compare that to the produce found at a local farmer's market in Georgia, we see that tomatoes only travel 8 miles, carrots and lettuce travel 28 miles, and strawberries only 26 miles. Now, when you purchase from a local farmer's market, you will, of course, be forced to buy foods that are seasonal. So in the middle of winter, you wouldn't be able to get fresh strawberries, for example, because they would be coming from places in the southern hemisphere or from California. There is no doubt that the increased agricultural production associated with the industrial and green revolutions has played a significant role in the growth of human populations over the past century. Nevertheless, a giant portion of Earth's people remains undernourished. Can we provide adequate nutrition to all of the world's people? Current trends suggest that our numbers will increase by another 2 to 3 billion people over the next 40 years. Can we ensure adequate food to match this growth in human numbers? In order to answer these questions in the affirmative, we must sustainably manage our agricultural resources, minimize waste, and ensure that the worldwide distribution of food is equitable. Sustainable agriculture includes careful stewardship of soil and water resources, maintenance of the genetic diversity of crops and domestic animals, the fostering of stability in agro systems, and minimization of negative environmental impacts. Most of all, sustainable agriculture requires long-term vision. To guarantee adequate food for all people, governments must develop stable, honest institutions, manage economic markets for agricultural economies, and improve systems of food distribution and storage. I wanted to mention one more thing about food availability. Since 2003, a segment of the corn crop in the United States has been used for ethanol production, and ethanol production has increased substantially over the years. Now, ethanol is a energy source that's renewable. However, by using corn, which is the source of ethanol, it impacts the amount of food available for human consumption. So although ethanol is a great resource, we do have to think about the cons associated with it.